For as much as I sing the praises of tournament play in League of Legends, the barrier to entry for most amateur leagues can be a bit high. Not everyone has access to 4 friends of equal rank who are equally interested in making the commitment to start a team, and therein lies the beauty of draft leagues. In a draft league, you sign up as an individual player. After playing some exhibition matches to get to know the captains, you'll be drafted to one of their teams and will go on to play a season as normal. This creates some fundamental differences from conventional tournament play, mainly that no team is expected to have a major synergy advantage. All of these teams are fighting to find their identities at the same time. I've personally played in a draft league twice. We don't speak much of the first time, in which I was on undoubtedly the worst team in the league. The second time, however, I became a VRD champion. My dramatically different experiences, despite no real perceived change in my skill level, gave me an interest in discovering how draft league strategy actually works. So I used my connections to help me gain far more experience than I would have simply playing for another split. After their draft, I contacted 7 players on 7 different teams within the Victoris Draft series, 4 in the upper division of VRD and 3 in the lower of VAD, which means I got myself involved with roughly half the league. Over the regular season, I sent out survey questions to each of these players, probing into their strategies and interpersonal dynamics. I watched games whenever I could, and I kept an ear out for any juicy drama. In this video, I'm going to be sharing the stories of these 7 teams from the point of view I was given, and I'm going to be using those stories to deepen our understanding of champion pools, team identity, and the fundamental approach to playing in a draft league. My hypothesis going into this video is that a specialized small pool player incorporated properly into a team is actually one of the most valuable assets during the draft. It's common, tested wisdom that the smaller your champion pool, the better you perform on your climb, and we've established in previous studies that this also applies to low-level amateur play. We expect to see that rigid, small pool teams find better results and lock down their identities faster than large pool teams using proper drafting principles, at least in the context of teams with no existing synergy. During the study, we also started to appreciate the importance of player motivations. It became clear quickly that studying only our original hypothesis would not actually be useful to all draft league players. So before I can start telling stories, we have to understand the 3 primary motivators for playing in a draft league: results, improvement, and fun. A results-motivated player wants to become a champion. They want their individual contributions to victory to be as consistent as possible. An improvement-motivated player wants to develop skills. They don't need to win as long as they perceive their time to be well spent. A fun-motivated player wants to make friends and play the champions they like. They will never troll the game, but they're just seeking better vibes and community than solo queue. A player's effective approach to a split can be guided by up to 2 motivators. A team meshes more immediately if all players are operating on similar motivations. So as we go through each team's story, think about our hypothesis and think about the motivators. Our story begins with the Wizards, the VRD 4th seed who, despite a very strong start, slowly bled out over the season, leading to a quarterfinals exit. From my perspective, there were 2 major factors contributing to their downfall. The first is that the Wizards adopted the most complicated approach to a split that I've ever seen. My contact on this team was the top laner, Melly G, a key component to my own Victoria split who I know from experience prides himself on his champion Ocean, and evidently the jungler and mid laner were similar types of players. The Wizards attempted to leverage these massive pools by scouting their opponents heavily and designing a unique game plan to counter each team's identity. In other words, their own identity was not static, it was dependent entirely on each unique opponent. This sounds like something I'd have tried myself if you asked me to captain a team a year ago. This sounds like a very fun approach to a competitive split, but it's also by far the most difficult approach we'll talk about in this video, and it was compounded by the second factor, the fact that the Wizards were obligated to use substitutes very, very often. During the regular season, the mid laner LGA was usually unable to play Game 1, creating effectively a 6-player roster with Tark. They had further substitutes in Week 4, 6, 7, and the quarterfinals. Notably, their strongest player, SideClick, was absent during their final 3 weeks. This means that the Wizards had a harder time building and using their synergy than other teams. As a team chasing strategic victories with large pools, the Wizards were the antithesis to our hypothesis. I would not have expected them to win the split, and the reason is simple. I think it's impossible for the Wizards to have known the ins and outs of all of their compositions, nor how to play those compositions with their specific 5 players. They struggled a lot when their initial game plan fell apart because the recovery plays couldn't be practiced, not just because of the substitutes, not just because of the complexity, but because the expectation is that draft league teams don't schedule scrim blocks. We know from previous studies that only the best teams in a league are given the luxury to practice unusual team comps. Learning and coordinating new ways of play requires specific practice time, because executing on a composition requires more than just individual knowledge and skills. And if you need to spend that practice time on refining your fundamentals or catching up to the skills of stronger teams, you can't spend it on new team comps. Now, don't get me wrong, the Wizards were performant in the early half of the split. They found their strategic victories while the other teams hadn't yet established an identity. They showed us some potential in finding results with this difficult approach, but they were vulnerable to factors outside of their control. A substitute is very disruptive to this approach, so if life gets in the way for one player once, it's so much harder for the Wizards to win. Large pool players like Melly can be very useful in designing a team's identity. On the Ducks, we tended to build around our ADC, so Melly decided to refine the tanks and enablers within his pool for that split. He became the specific small pool player we needed because he had access to a large pool, and he became very good at those champions. So if the Wizards were motivated by fun or by improvement, trying to expose themselves to new situations to expand their horizons, then their split was successful. But I suspect that they were results-oriented, or they wouldn't have gone out of their way to scout their opponents so extensively. And if they were results-oriented, then it does seem likely that they'd have been more successful by keeping it simple. Next, we have the Nocturnals, the VAD third seed who were eliminated in quarterfinals. The Nocturnals enjoyed a very stable split and had to solve very normal problems. They struck fast on their identity issues, they had only one substitute during 1 week, and they had a mix of small pool and large pool players. They were arguably the most average team will cover, most likely to go 2-1 each week during the regular season. But under the surface, they were plagued by some irreconcilable differences in their approach. One issue rooted in motivations, and one in draft. My contact on this team was Captain Beepots, who wanted to emphasize player comfort above all other factors, something that would become very important for his own contributions to his team. Motivated by results and improvement, Beepots was set to play off-role top lane. He used strong role swap fundamentals and declared a small pool of primarily tanks, one-tricking a familiar style as we discussed in our role swap video. As a result, he immediately became his team's stylistic consistency point. Most of the Nocturnals shared results and improvement-based motivations with Beepots, but the first major problem they faced was that the team wasn't set up to satisfy those motivations. It was designed for fun. Some housekeeping after starting with a 2-4 record revealed that their top laner and jungler were more comfortable on each other's roles. Swapping their positions was a no-brainer. But support Joe Barden, motivated primarily by fun, the only player with mismatched motivations, required a different solution. One metagame system available in a draft league is the ability to trade players between teams. I thought this is only done when a team hits their breaking point, but the Nocturnals proved me wrong. They realized that Joe Barden's motivations would be better satisfied by playing with his friends on the Grizzlies, and in exchange got Vhagar or Feed. Both teams got a better fit for their rosters. I'd have never considered this immediate shakeup as an option. My approach has historically always been to see what we can make out of the pieces we have, no matter the effort required. I find it exciting to dive into fresh team dynamics, but that excitement is rooted in an improvement and fun approach. For raw results, I can see why exploring an early trade makes sense within the Draft League metagame if it's been established early that your team fits a try-hard vibe. And so, the Nocturnals solved their motivation issue. The new roster ended up being built around a guaranteed facilitator by Beepots in the jungle, with the other players playing a very diverse set of styles. But is that champion pool diversity in opposition to Beepots' goal of prioritizing comfort? To answer this question, I also spoke to draft lead Ishan, who was first picked for the Nocturnals explicitly for his drafting knowledge. According to him, their approach was based on proper drafting principles: comp cohesion, flex picks, damage spread, etc. Ishan was given lists of each player's pools, proposed 2 to 3 options on each mid-draft decision point, and accepted the player's counter-suggestion about half the times one was proposed. So we know for sure that Nocturnals players were sometimes playing picks they were less experienced on for the sake of the comp. That is objectively at odds with Beepots' goals. But it's only completely at odds if Ishan never compromised with the player's comfort level. And we do have evidence that when something went wrong in the draft, the Nocturnals opted to salvage it by picking comfort picks. On screen now is their worst draft of the season, which is maybe an unfair example, but the only way you end up with a Kai'Sa Zillion lane, a Wukong with no engage setup and only Kai'Sa as a dive partner, and a primary win condition of Mordekaiser's lane matchup is if you gave your players their comfort picks. My issue is that if this is a team who got used to playing off comp cohesion, they weren't practicing raw execution on their comfort picks. They would be worse at playing this out than the other teams. This is the second irreconcilable difference in their approach. We have one leader who wanted to play in line with this study's hypothesis, and another who wanted to play the opposite. Leaning fully into Beepot's approach would have prepared the Nocturnals to be better players in worse drafts. Leaning fully into Ishan's approach is the theoretical most dominant path to victory, as long as the players can execute on that drafting knowledge, and our hypothesis says they can't at this level. Trying to do both means that Ishan's job is both harder and more punishing. He has to be more aware of niche weirdo champion properties, and if he makes one mistake during the draft, the Nocturnals become more likely to lose than their peers. That's a lot of pressure to put onto one player, even if you picked him explicitly for that skill. The Nocturnals helped us to find one possible solution to mismatched motivations. They demonstrated the exact difficulty in using proper drafting principles in a gold to plat amateur league. They didn't make it far into playoffs, in part because they were too vulnerable to minor drafting errors during the quarterfinals. But they were almost very performant. Despite their issues, they still demonstrated some potential in making the most of large pools within a draft league. Their approach was difficult, but not impossible. I love the Panthers. Nobody proved exactly the initial point I was planning to make at the start of my study more perfectly than this roster. But to understand why their story is so great, you need to understand the VDS's draft structure. The VRD and VAD this year actually shared their player pool between both leagues. While the VRD drafted first and naturally drafted the players more qualified for the upper division, any VRD captain could draft a weaker player expected to fall down into the VAD. And that's exactly what happened to my contact Becky Rita. The moment the Panthers drafted him as their last pick, his confidence in the split plummeted because he did not expect to be qualified for the upper division. Becky was initially perceived as the biggest meme draft in the entire league. The Panthers went all the way to Game 5 Grand Finals before finally being eliminated in a nail-bitingly close series. Our unqualified, low-confidence player was inches away from becoming a champion. I attribute this in part to the Panthers captain correctly calling out that Becky's playstyle was exactly what the team needed. They had strong laners across the board, but no guaranteed proactivity. So Becky, known as an Udyr and Maokai player, was the perfect glue. A player guaranteed to scale alongside the Panthers' expected playstyle, supplement their expected laning advantages, and drive the game forwards in the mid-game. The Panthers took themselves seriously and adopted small pools across the board. Their mid laner had a very clear set of champions they were much better on than the others. Their support primarily played ranged champions, their bot laner played hyper carries, and their top laner opted for a bruiser core of Set and Aatrox. Though they suffered from some dissonant drafting early on, they sat down after week 4 to declare their identity. First, they drafted for multiple catch tools per game, then with the release of Milio, they pivoted towards a pure scaling teamfight identity with a single point of entry. Predictable? Yes. Effective? Oh yeah. It's easier to be really good at executing on the one thing you do well than trying to diversify, especially when the one thing you do well is unlikely to be punished perfectly. When a team proves something we already know and expect to learn, there's not much to say. We know that small pools help us to clean up execution and improve faster than the competition. But to reiterate the draft's metagame point, the first round may always go to the perceived best player in the least competitive role, but perceived skill becomes much less important than perceived fit onto a team by the final round. A fifth player who matches your team's general motivations and needs from a champion pool is likely going to be more effective than a fifth player who is technically individually better, but doesn't mesh. I've opted to cover the Unicorns and the Hounds together because their stories are intimately connected. On the one hand, we have the Unicorns, the weakest team we followed, the VAD 7th seed who did not qualify for playoffs. On the other hand, we had the Hounds, who became the Spring 2023 VAD champions, and yet, both teams made each other stronger. This story begins well before the actual split because my contacts on these teams should be familiar faces if you frequent my community. Sonic X5040 represented the Unicorns, while Darwin represented the Hounds. The two signed up primarily to play against a friend every week, both off-role. Sonic signed up for mid lane, Darwin, experiencing a mental implosion over mid lane, signed up as a support. Both communicated to me that they expected to play with massive pools, which worried me because I know both of their tendencies intimately. Sonic is prone to autopilot, and Darwin is ungodly aggressive, so I expected both to need mastery over a small pool to stay focused and to execute on skirmishes. But that's for results. Both approach the split with fun motivations, and both enjoy exploring new champions. There's no way to put this less bluntly. The Unicorns imploded immediately. By week 2, they'd already tried a 3-way role swap. They were already at each other's throats. Shu and Sonic became the bot lane, Milk Cows and Wolven became the mid-jungle duo, and both pairs of players became two sides in an outright civil war. From what I can infer, Milk Cows correctly identified that it was his responsibility to step up and become a leader, but his approach was not effective for this roster. There was some resentment building that Captain Shu wasn't allowed to run the draft, and that every decision he made was loudly flamed until it was reverted. In Week 4, they tried to run Sonic ADC and Shu support, a configuration the two had played in a previous split, but since Milk Cows and Wolven perceived Sonic as too incompetent to breathe, they did not let her stay in a carry role. Team dynamics around vision control were not established. It was simply the support's fault no matter who the support was. This was not a team. Nobody was actually a teammate in this dynamic. On the Hounds side, this roster immediately found their style and began tearing up the league. Their playstyle was extremely consistent. Andy Gwynn would take a hard carry and try to win through wave management. Corruptor played initiators. Amiyanki was always piloting a scaling or setup mage. Darwin always launched something that enabled his aggression, and Arsenal picked a hyper carry. 5 players, all playing consistent comfort, all playing for laning advantages within a comp that could fall back on their teamfight scaling if those advantages never came through. This is yet another very performant team with pools that could complement each other, playing small pools they knew they could execute on, supporting our hypothesis. Except there was one hiccup. Arsenal and Darwin did not mesh stylistically. Arsenal was a slower player without a lot of confidence in their raw laning, which did not suit Darwin's tendency to skirmish or die trying. The two reportedly got along decently, and Darwin did his best to encourage Arsenal to believe in their ability to 2v2, but that's a hard sell when half of your plays are utter coin flips. So after a particularly bad week of play from Darwin, we saw an absolutely insane move. The first place and last place team made a trade after week 4 between non-matching roles, Arsenal to the Unicorns from Milk Cows to the Hounds, and the trade was somehow mutually beneficial. As Darwin reports, Milk Cows had simply adopted a very orthodox sports mindset. When the game begins, there is no nonsense or experimentation. The team should rein each other in, and everyone is expected to give 110% of their focus. Milk Cow settled into a bot lane playstyle that enabled Darwin's aggressive picks as much as possible, primarily locking Seraphine and Swain to create Senna angles. Though Darwin initially perceived Milk Cows to be very intense, especially when it came to scheduling practice time, by the end he really appreciated having someone to veto his coin flips. He felt Milk Cows actually contributed something very positive to the team dynamic. On the Unicorn side, they experienced one last role swap to make room for Arsenal, and team morale improved. They were still explicitly a weaker team than the competition. They did genuinely try to win, they hadn't given up despite their results. But the trade removed the intense pressure to perform, giving them a greater environment to focus on skill development and valuable mistakes. It is not realistic for every draft league team to approach the tournament with the intention to win. Sometimes that mindset forces you into an uphill battle guaranteed to cause suffering, putting expectations on yourself that just cannot, with your current knowledge and execution, be met. Every split there's at least one team that completely explodes. In fact, this split there were 3 across the 2 divisions, but fortunately we picked the only one who actually managed to pivot their mindset and solve some of their problems. Having previously been on the actual bottom team, Dragons, in fall 2021, I can empathize with the Unicorns. I wasn't equipped at the time to know how to design our team identity, nor did I remotely have the skills to fill the role that I now understand my team needed. It would have been most productive to solve that problem, abandon all pretenses of winning the split, and focus on skill development. It would have been more productive had our top laner not been flaming everyone besides me, but he clearly wanted to win, and therein lies the problem. Milk Cows is not inherently wrong for approaching the split with a desire for results, nor was Sonic wrong for approaching it with a desire to enjoy herself, but I'm now sure motivations have to be malleable. If I want results but find myself in an environment where my teammates want improvement or fun, either I have to be mature enough to shift my expectations, or I need to be traded early. The same goes for if I want results but my roster simply doesn't work well enough for that. I think Milk Cows' mindset would have been far better suited to a pre-made league where he can guarantee teammates who appreciate the intensity of his approach, like Darwin. A refusal to adapt to the reality of the Unicorns' circumstances bred some very intense toxicity and, dare I say, abuse. I would be interested to know if in future splits, captains could benefit from explicitly knowing a player's motivations up front. I wonder if a system could be designed to know ahead of time whether a player wants to be on a full try-hard roster, whether they just want people to help with skill building, or whether they just think tournament play sounds like fun. If this could be incorporated into pre-draft player scouting, I expect we'd see fewer volatile rosters. Originally, my contact on this team, Metro Dragneel, was supposed to be a very important character within this study. Metro is a known quantity within the VDS. Every captain knows exactly the type of assassin and bruiser pool he'll bring, exactly the type of volatile playstyle he enjoys, and exactly the skill level he's at. Metro is the type of player who can't fit into just any team. He's specific and specialized, and I thought really paying attention to which rosters can leverage his strengths into success would be a key area to understand. Except Metro's never really been playing for raw results. That's not the type of player he is. He knows he's way too aggressive, and he's been loosely focusing on reining that in, but he's primarily in the league to enjoy himself. He was also set to off-roll this split and was drafted to an absolutely cursed roster, so we were not going to learn about integration by following him. Instead, we get to use this unstable team to expand upon everything we've talked about so far. There was a meme on the Hornets that they were led to victory by their substitutes. There were precisely 2 weeks over the entire split in which they actually played with their full main roster. For one game in week 5, they had exactly one main roster player in their proper role. This is the most extreme substitute situation I've ever seen, and it absolutely complicated the development of a style. But to introduce that main roster, Captain Giggle was also primarily motivated by fun, signing up for off-roll support. His first pick ADC, Enders, was undoubtedly their strongest player who tended towards lane dominance picks. Mid laner Mollywops was a stable mage player who was more than happy to lean heavily into utility, even jumping on some tank mid lane picks. And jungler Raynor was just as bloodthirsty as Metro, but he at least expressed that bloodthirst in the form of util heavy bruisers. So although the Hornets had a lot of players with extreme playstyles who just wanted to have a good time, they still at least recognized that the raw strength of Enders was likely to win them games, and they focused their in-game efforts on impacting bot lane. So imagine how damning it was to this roster when Enders ranked out of eligibility in the league and had to be replaced. Worst of all, they chose me to replace him. I personally stepped in as the Hornets support, moving Giggle back to ADC for a reunion of half of the Dragons roster. But don't worry, before I agreed to play, I made sure none of our study participants had a problem with it, and everyone trusted me not to use my survey results to my competitive advantage. Not wanting to introduce my biases too much, I planned to just step into the Hornets' existing style and relinquish control of the draft, but I couldn't conform to their playstyle if they had no playstyle to begin with. The Hornets had never practiced playing around their volatile players. They didn't know exactly how to approach their game, which led to some ugly drafting. I imagine the sheer quantity of substitutes didn't help. Enders had been their only consistent point. So I did step in a little more aggressively. We defined some specific champions to prioritize in early rotations, and we made it work enough to reach playoffs as the 6th seed, eventually being eliminated in semifinals, which is honestly most likely the best result we could hope for. There's a few conclusions I want to draw from my time playing with this roster. First, there's a game in which Metro was pressured into playing Ornn. This happens every split. Metro's given an orthodox pick which he has no idea how to pilot and loses the game. If you have a specialized player who isn't comfortable branching out, you must adapt to it no matter how volatile they are. Second, when I stepped in, the Hornets were the only team in the league who no longer had an identity. And if the entire Draft League metagame is about the race to find your identity, it's extremely difficult to play for results when you're playing catch-up. That makes this another good example in favor of the need to adapt your expectations. I planned to take a back seat, but the fun-motivated Hornets still did want to try their best and did want my contributions in draft. My responsibility as a good teammate is to learn how I slot into this specific roster, how much of a leader or follower I need to be, and whether we want to try our hardest to win each individual game. And in doing so, I can play a very satisfying, improvement-focused split just by playing on a new team. Since the Hornets played different compositional archetypes than my main team, I realized I was struggling in my pre-combat shot calling and had some significant blind spots in how I was thinking during the game. So even though we didn't get results, and even though I played less than half a split, I still found great value in joining the VRD's most cursed roster. Perhaps the biggest surprise in the entire split was just how poorly the Vipers performed. Every player on this roster is at least somewhat known within the Victoris community, and expectations were that this team would easily make playoffs. But under the leadership of my contact, Beanie, the Vipers finished as the VRD's 7th seed, eliminated in the regular season. Before I realized just how ridiculous the pool diversity on the Wizards was, I was tracking Beanie for unique champions played, and from what I had observed, that large pool was key to the Vipers' identity. I perceived their playstyle as revolving around hard-scaling side lanes, exploiting access to a variety of mid-lane counter picks and a large supplementary jungle pool as their early-game driving force. But maybe I simply caught them on a good week, as that was not Beanie's perception of the team. Beanie was deeply uncomfortable during the entire split because he was suffering from some severe confidence issues. He rated himself as an extremely inconsistent player, especially when he wasn't on his melee AD comfort champs. But he also felt that his less practiced mage pool was more in line with what the team needed. On closer inspection, he died very often on his off picks. He believed that a carry performance from himself would require heavy investment from his teammates and would result in a coin flip anyway, so it would be better to invest into the bot lane. Despite my perceived identity of the Vipers, Beanie would never hold R5 for himself, and he would never prioritize his comfort. Confidence issues affected at least one player on the Unicorns, Hounds, Nocturnals, and Panthers in a major way. They're actually extremely common in these leagues, but on those rosters they didn't affect one of the most critical pieces of the team. And to Beanie's credit, he's not wrong for rating himself as inconsistent, but I do feel that the approach of the Vipers sabotaged them in the long run. Beanie plays for improvement, but never at the expense of results, and paradoxically, playing for results by drafting what he believed was most important for his team each game left him too uncomfortable on every pick to actually get those results. Now, I can't tell Beanie what the correct approach would have been. I don't know whether it was best to insist he play his physical picks, or to stick to a small mage pool for the sake of development, or to embrace the coin flip counter picks and limit test for experience. I do know that being results motivated without faith that you can actually get those results is just going to lead to suffering as you fail to achieve victory. The reality is that Beanie's team was set up to give him resources, so if he had put himself in the driver's seat with an improvement-based mindset, that could have been a very productive experience. So far, the results we've seen have been in line with my hypothesis. The teams with small focused pools put up incredible results, while the teams trying to draft properly with large pools generally stumbled, but that doesn't feel wholly satisfying. The Nocturnals and the Wizards both came close to great results, and the Vipers were stifled by non-gameplay factors. We learned so much about player motivations and malleable roles as a teammate, which introduces another critical factor to this whole problem. So we can't conclude with just these 7 teams. Fortunately, the Vipers story reminds me a lot about another team who may prove important to blowing this study wide open. In fall 2022, I became a VRD champion, and with the context of this study, I realized that my very own path to success expands on some of the key concepts of being a good teammate and contradicts my own hypothesis. Though I was captain of this team, we were truly led by our ADC Dallas, enjoying his last split of eligibility in the league before he ranked out. Dallas was no doubt the strongest player in the league, but what really struck me about him was how he used his presence on our team to uplift everyone else rather than to have an ego about it. There was a Dallas and 4 wards narrative following our team, which he actively tried to fight off, adamant that everyone's contributions were necessary for his success. Much like Beanie, I was struggling with some severe confidence issues entering the split. My intentions were to play primarily for improvement, but I felt this compulsion to put up results or be judged by my peers, and under the constraints of zero self-esteem, I didn't put up results. Our start was appalling. We were 0-6 at the end of week 2, but Dallas didn't give up on us. He kept working to build up our confidence, to convince us that we were good players, that these setbacks were normal on the path to improvement. He continued trusting me to run the draft despite my perception that I'd lost my touch. That split became a major pillar for my self-esteem. My ADC believed in me, I picked myself back up, and we proceeded to drop only a single game for the rest of the regular season. That's a true leader. That's an excellent teammate. That's a player who used his past experience and flexible expectations to fill exactly the role that we needed. If we had an ADC who instead flamed us for our performance and didn't explore new ways to be a good teammate, no one would have been able to achieve results, improvement, or fun. But it goes both ways, because I could have chosen to wallow in my self-pity as well. Entering a draft league means you have to be prepared to be an uplifting teammate to whoever ends up on your team, and you have to be prepared to show the courage it takes to put yourself out there, look stupid, and try again anyway. Once I had some of my confidence back, I quickly settled back into my own core style. I trend towards ranged support, but I'm willing to play initiators, wardens, mages, enchanters, and unorthodox off-meta in positive spots. As someone who'd spent the previous several years of my league experience diving into strategy more than playing, I chased strategic victories. With the best ADC in the league at my side, our team's identity centered around either stomping or neutralizing bot lane, then empowering our carry into the mid game. Sure, I'm never beating the Yuumi player allegations because of this split, but the reality is that we played a lot of distinct lanes to handle each situation. However, this experience goes against my hypothesis and was the source of so much confusion and anxiety during my jungle role swap, so I cannot believe I failed to think about it for so long. I was a large pool player, and I won. I was a large pool player to the point that I've built a reputation of playing virtually unknown counterpicks. On the Hornets this split, we busted out Zig's support as a Melio answer, and I've met so many large pool players who are perfectly competent within these leagues. JS Chaotic from our Duck split, Beanie, Melly G, among others. How can we reconcile this against proven conventional wisdom that small pools are better? Fortunately, I think my experience answers this. On every pick that I piloted, I was simply not very mechanically proficient. I drafted to never be forced into a position in which I must outplay my opponent. I was an excellent member of a team with contributions that could only be appreciated by my teammates, but I would never have been capable of carrying myself to a new solo queue rank with that skill set. My strategic approach never required me to push myself for new skill development or to expand the number of things I was thinking about. I was exactly capable of thriving in this level of play in this coordinated environment. While Dallas fully expected my skill set to bring me to high diamond before I had to improve drastically, I now believe that my competitive skill set was inherently stagnating. Within the amateur ecosystem, there are many players who have no real desire to improve beyond the level they're at. These are players who just despise the experience of playing solo queue, who would rather solve problems within a team context, and who simply enjoy League of Legends as a team game. If a player reaches a level in which they're fully competent within amateur play at their current rank, and they choose to build out their pool over time rather than learning new higher level concepts, they're not going to climb and they're not going to reach higher divisions of amateur play, but they're going to become a better competitive player. And so that's why when I started my role swap, I held the incorrect belief that matchups and perfect drafts are critically important even below Masters. I never pushed myself to improve my execution. I had to become a small pool player in the jungle to help me build up my skill set, but I had the luxury of being a large pool player in support because my skill set was sufficient for my challenges. And now understanding that, sure, playing a ton of champions gave me some valuable perspective, but it only helped me to improve as an analyst, not as a player, and I kind of regret not getting out of my comfort zone. But if you're motivated primarily by fun and by results, not by improvement, if playing in an amateur league is that social thing you do after work to unwind, this is a totally legitimate approach. We did observe the small pool single playstyle teams being the most successful during the split. That still makes sense. In the race to find an identity, it is still far easier to refine one way of playing and to quickly become the best in the league at playing that. We started to better understand player motivations within a draft league. When a team is aligned in motivations, it's far easier to build a constructive team environment. We learned that loose experience on a large pool helps you to temporarily lock in the correct small pool for your roster if you're motivated by results and improvement. But we also learned that it is possible to build yourself up to being a successful large pool player as long as you don't desire to climb outside of the league. I've always been the type of player who keeps my head down, who stays in my own lane, who doesn't engage with the greater community as much as I could, but I now see that getting to know your fellow players actually makes the draft league experience so much more fulfilling. From a captain's perspective, understanding player pools, motivations, and personalities either gives you a real tactical advantage or lets you build the perfect meme squad. From any player's perspective, having compassion for the limitations of your teammates gives you the opportunity to try taking on different responsibilities within the team, which is great for improvement or fun. And for any new player interested in playing in a draft league for the first time, understanding that you don't necessarily need to be the flexible one makes it easier to have the courage to take that first step. That may not be exactly what we set out to learn at the beginning of this study, but I'd argue that's a much more valuable takeaway. Thank you so much to my patrons, SonicX5040, Mel7401, Hailfire, Thomas Siemens, and Mario Sacramento. Your support makes these videos possible.